Red Blood Black Flag, sharing some random thoughts I was having right now I thought were interesting. If you are an anarchist, a legit anarchist, a true anarchist that is, which there is such a thing, but if you're an anarchist, undoubtedly you realize that all statists believe the same fundamental things at the root of the belief, right? Basically everybody, the belief in government is the belief in government, and there's maybe if you want to call them different denominations, right? But they, at the root, they all share the same fundamental beliefs, and namely the belief is that slavery can be legitimate, can be rightful. That's basically the belief in government, the most concise way to describe it, I guess. But so you realize that they all basically share that same fundamental belief, and a couple others too. There's maybe a handful or maybe even a dozen or so aspects of that particular belief that permeate the mind state, and so they share common beliefs in some things. Like you basically necessarily have to believe in political borders or immigration control to some extent or another if you believe in a country, basically, because they go hand in hand. Like if you didn't have political borders, you basically wouldn't have a country. So basically, even if you're like a Democrat who believes in either very little or maybe even no immigration control, you would still hold this belief of political jurisdiction. Otherwise, you would clearly be an anarchist. Like if you got to that point where you did not believe in, or you realized that political borders didn't exist basically and were spurious, and there's no such thing as a country, then I just don't see how you could believe that and still be a Democrat or a statist, period. So it's a fundamental aspect of it, I would say. So there's some things that work that way. But one thing I just realized, though, is that a communist, like, the thing is that people are trained to think that a state is necessary. The necessity of government is a necessary evil, and yada, yada, yada. And I noticed that a socialist, even though they would like to say that they advocate a stateless society in the future, they don't think that would be good now. They say we can't do that unless we abolish capitalism. And I mean, that's really irrelevant. The reason why is irrelevant to the logic, right? Like the statement here, the proposition is that the state is necessary. Whether you say now or forever or whatever, you're going to say one of those. And a socialist thinks that a state is necessary now to protect the workers and whatnot. Even an anarcho-communist believes that, because in my experience anyway, like they believe that, because they say no, we can't. I mean, here's the thing: is that if we didn't, quote, abolish capitalism, which I'm not an advocate of. I mean, depending on what you mean, but I mean, to me, that just seems a ridiculous statement. But for a couple of reasons, and depending on what you mean, it would be horribly immoral, and you would just be the next tyrant if you tried to do that. But would you not accept, if you're an anarcho-communist, would you not accept at least the abolition of the current state? And I'm not saying, because I think a socialist would say the capitalists are just going to make another state. And it's like, okay, we'll let them and we'll abolish that one too. We just abolish the state. Like, abolish the state isn't I mean, it's a here and now type of statement, but it's an ultimate statement in that what we mean is abolish government forever. Like, get rid of the state as soon as possible and never bring it back. So we're not saying, like a socialist would say, well, okay, maybe they would say, that's my question, is would you accept the abolition of the state right now, even if there was no capitalist, if so-called capitalism hasn't been abolished? And to me, I can't see how you could say that you wouldn't. What would be the worst thing that is going to happen? Is that the capitalists are going to make a new state? And you might say, well, okay, you can't say it was was it a waste of time? They would probably say what we say to state worshipers is that, well, you're missing the point, is that the capitalists are just going to make another one. And the thing is that the capitalists, when you say the capitalist this and the capitalist that, it's you're saying like all of them do it, or it's fundamental, when it's really not. We're Lenin, Mao, and Stalin capitalists. If you think that, there's clearly a misunderstanding of what these terms mean, or we're operating on different definitions. But But I think it's interesting that even the anarcho-communists, so called, and definitely the socialists, state socialists, and the common Democrats and whatnot, um, I find it interesting that even they believe that the state is necessary just for different reasons. Like they say, like right now, a Republican will say, and a Democrat would probably say, a Republican or a Democrat would probably say something really generic, just like, we need the state to, protect us. And, I mean, geez, it's so foreign right now. I can't even really think of, like, what you would be thinking to say these things. But, um, so they would say the state is necessary to protect our property, and they obviously would believe that, like, in perpetuity. They would think that that's forever a case. That without government, obviously everybody's going to be running around and killing each other, they believe. So, but I find it interesting, as I said, that the socialists seem to believe that the state is necessary as well, at least in the here and now, because capitalism is still around. And it's just, I mean, well, what would it matter? Just abolish the state anyway. I mean, the thing is that the socialists are backwards. Like this capitalist, the state exists mainly because of the belief in the minds of the so-called citizens. It's the masses of people who believe that the state's commands are legitimate and must be obeyed that allows this institution to arise to begin with. Because without that belief, the capitalists or whoever can, they can issue whatever commands that they want. And if nobody believes them, they're not going to obey, and they're going to defend themselves when these lunatics try to enforce their so-called laws. So it isn't that the capitalists are just going to make another state. They can try, and psychos will try to tyrannize people. But the main problem of the belief in government is that everyone else believes they're legitimate in doing so. It's not that the capitalists are going to make another state. It's that the citizens believe that legislation and the state alter morality and are supposed to be obeyed no matter what. Like, no matter what is actually the belief. They say this and that as long as they're not violating this right or that right, but that is not the belief in government. And when they speak, you can tell that that is what they really believe, that government is allowed to do whatever it wants to do. They are just so indoctrinated that they don't see it. And how that is showcased is that when you look at what's actually happening and you see a guy in a black uniform or whatever with a shiny piece of metal on his chest and a gun and a club, and he's going into this other guy's house who's not committing violence, hasn't hurt, hasn't stole, hasn't robbed anything. He's just growing pot. And when you see that guy doing violence to him, but then when you look at the example as if it were I or you or someone else doing, just a regular so-called citizen who's not perceived to be government doing the exact same thing, they don't see that it's the same action and the same thing happening. Like if one of those actions is theft, then all of those actions, no matter who does it, is theft. The only time is not as in landlord, is if you're renting the place, it's not your house, or you're staying at your buddy's or something, and he doesn't want you smoking weed and he kicks you out. That's not the same thing because that's his house. But the difference here is that your house isn't my house, and your house isn't the cop's house, and your house isn't the politician's house. Though they all believe that they do have the right to control you and your property. And that is why government is the belief that slavery is legitimate. But it's interesting to me that, that's the point. That is what government is. It's not that the capitalists are going to oppress everyone because they want to control resources. Yeah, people might try to do that, but they can only get away with it with this particular, permeating means called government, called the state, this most tyrannical of gangs, basically, out of all of the gangs, if everyone else believes that it's legitimate, or, I mean, there is a possibility, I guess, that they issue the command and not one single person believes their authority, nor do they defend themselves because they are scared of dying or something. That's a possibility, but it's highly, highly, highly unlikely. Right? That nobody is going to defend themselves from a guy trying to control them who they don't think has the right to control them. 310 million people, 535 or 536 politicians in Congress, and you're going to tell me that nobody is going to try and defend themselves from the politicians and the cops who enforce their commands if they don't believe that they're rightful in issuing those commands. Yeah, it's possible, but it's highly, highly unlikely, right? And so, and this, as I'm saying, it's just the point is that it's not like the socialists speak as if the capitalist is government, basically, and that capitalist can do whatever he wants, and he's just going to impose the state and blah 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 blah. And because I mean, I've noticed that they do believe that when they say capitalists, what they mean is the government. That's usually what they mean. They like view capitalists to be authority. They view the capitalist as being the one who, interestingly, they view him as not having the right to steal from him, which is true. Obviously, he thinks the capitalist is stealing from him, but he's not in the general actual context of what a capitalist is. There may be a capitalist who's out there stealing from people. I'm sure there are, but it's not what a capitalist actually is in the market. It's not a thief. But so they view like the capitalist as government. Like all the things that they're saying the capitalist does is actually what the government does. Rob you, control your life, force you to labor for them, basically. Take your money if you work for someone else. All the things that government does, they blame the capitalist for. So it's like they view the capitalist as being government. But really, they don't, because they don't think the capitalist has the right to rob them. If you believe the capitalist is government and authority, like this actually happened once, right? So I am talking to a communist, and I said, "Is the capitalist authority?" Because this got me thinking. Like he's talking like the capitalist is government. And so I asked him, "Is the capitalist authority?" He said, "Yeah," but he doesn't believe that, because if he did believe the capitalist authority, he'd be obeying everything that he said. He wouldn't be arguing with him. He's the capitalist authority. That's what people believe with government. That's why they don't disobey. That's why they say we need to obey those guys, because they're authority. If they didn't believe they were authority, they wouldn't obey them. They'd be like, "Who's this crazy guy trying to control my life and tell me what to do and whatnot with my property and things?" So there's just some interesting things, though. The commonality there between the socialists and everybody who believes in authority, basically, in government, is that it's necessary. And the thing about socialism is that, I mean, if you're a socialist, would you want to keep the state around? If you're like, how many thousands of years would have to go by before you say, okay, let's just abolish the state because capitalism's still here? And I mean, socialists probably think capitalism won't last that long. That people are going to wake up and yada, 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 which might be. I don't think capitalism is going anywhere, but people might wake up to a lot of the problems of what people think property is, because, the market is saturated with statism, and the market is saturated with phony concepts of property that aren't necessarily tied to the state, though basically are the same thing in action. They end up governing other people, because they believe things are their property that are not. And I don't mean factories and stuff and the general communist line. I just mean like open fields that nobody's touched. I mean, most of that is facilitated by the state, but people do take that kind of as given in the market, where it's like they buy and sell like barren land and things, and because somebody got there and checked it out and was like, well, that's mine. And, yeah, sure, if you have an intention to do something on it, I guess people should maybe honor that, at least for a while. But, how long does this thing got to sit there until you actually build something? Like, you have to mix your labor within some significant way for it to actually be your property. So, but I think that that's a part that communists criticize, which actually is a valid criticism. And a lot of that kind of works that way in the market. Though, not so much in the populated areas, obviously, because there's not so much just outright vacant land that nobody's touched. So somebody made something, sold it, or lost it to the state, unfortunately, because they couldn't pay property taxes. Because if you have all these property taxes and whatnot, you basically own that house forever. Then you don't have to ever pay anyone else to live at least in that house. So. But anyway, yeah, I don't know. Totally random rants, I guess. I was just interesting. It was interesting to me that, the socialists, they say that they want the state to be gone, but they still think it's necessary, at least for the time being. And so if we never, like, what should be the primary goal? Or do you do it simultaneously? Like, my thing is that, you don't abolish capitalism. That's my view. But because you're going to end up being a tyrant, based on what those words actually mean. which is, you're saying that you think someone should control all of the factories, or you should take over all the factories and they should all be owned by everyone. And, I mean, that just doesn't make any sense. But, like, if you go at it simultaneously, like, I mean, I would agree if the state, what they call capitalism is what we would probably call like corporatism or mercantilism, or, these types of things, fascism. But I mean, and that is kind of the key. The key about all those things, like, what's the common denominator between all of that? Think of mercantilism, fascism, corporatism. They might disagree with this, but I mean, the common denominator between all of them is the government. Is all of those are dependent on the government or tied to the government in some way. Fascism is dependent on the government. You can't have fascism without government. It's, essentially by definition a merger of so-called corporate and state power, and that's basically what corporatocracy is anyway, as opposed to corporatism, which is a slightly different term in a lot of circles, but I just call it corporatism, because I'm talking about politics, so what I'm talking about the state. I mean that. So abolish the government, and fascism is theoretically impossible. I'm not saying that some gang isn't going to try to take over and start controlling everyone and things, but you wouldn't look at that as being like a fascist government, right? You would just look at that as the crazy guys who are trying to control everyone, which is all government is. Well, that's all the state is. Government is the hallucination that the state is different when it does those things. I mean, but they're essentially inextricably linked. Without the belief in government, you wouldn't have states. And without that belief, you're not going to call some gang the state. The only reason you call them the state is because you believe in government and so on and so forth. And I use that too. But I mean, there are a few fundamental characteristics of a state. But if some other group did those things that you didn't think was authority, you're still not going to call them the state. Like if aliens came over and took over the planet and forced everyone, nobody was like, no, aliens can come take over me. Nobody said yes. Aliens show up and enslave everyone in chains. You're not going to call them government. You're not going to call them the state. Even if in some discussions you'd be like, the state is the one who has the power. It doesn't matter, because to them that's what they say. Whoever's the most powerful is government, or whoever's, might makes right. It's the same thing as might makes right. So, but that's not actually what the belief is, because if they got robbed or if they got enslaved by a street gang, a different street gang besides the so-called state, or someone, they're not going to call them government. They're not going to call them the authorities. They're not going to call them the state if they got robbed by a different gang, or a gang that they don't think has the right to rule them. That's the only reason they call them the government, is because they think has the right to tell them what to do, and it's different when it does so. But yeah, interesting commonalities in my opinion anyway, since I just spent 18 minutes ranting about them. But yeah, I guess that's the end of that. It's just government is not necessary. It never has been. It's never going to be. It is in no way necessary to pick some group of people, or to have a group of people claiming that their authority can alter morality, can alter your rights, have the right to control everyone even when they don't hurt anyone, have the right to force you to go fight in war and kill people and die, and claim a monopoly on force is basically, I guess, the fundamental thing is like, in no way is it necessary to say that there's only one group that should be punishing bad guys, even if you believe in the whole concept of where, like, you need a third party because they're impartial and you would be more prone to impose harsh if you were a vigilante, and yada, yada, yada. I mean, that still doesn't make that third party a state necessarily. A state is just a third party that says it's the only one that's allowed to be the third party. And if you, for the most part anyway, I mean, there's some differences in like civil arbitration and stuff like that, but still all of that, the state says they're the ones who allow you to do that. And if you guys just made your own court system, they'd put you in the cage because you can't compete. And in most people's minds, it's not so much a market competition thing. To them, they view it as immoral if you started your own court system. It's not financial in that reasoning for them. It's just they think that you're immoral. You're a vigilante criminal. Even if you followed all the same procedures and all the same rules of evidence and even if you like didn't subpoena the guy, but you gave him the opportunity to speak his mind, publicized that you were bringing these charges against him, ran through the case in the same way the state does, presenting all the same evidence and all the same everything else, and then put out a so-called warrant or a bounty on this guy because you have proven beyond a reasonable doubt, according to a jury of peers, or the court of public opinion. I mean, shit, dude, doing it on YouTube could be just as justified as long as you do it right, as long as you show all the evidence. The only difference is they think you're immoral if you do it, but it's okay for the state to do it for one reason or another. There really isn't no reason. It's just taken as a given. Authority has the right to rule because it is authority. It's circular, but that's the belief. So you don't, in their mind have the right. So but in no way is it necessary to tell everyone else that they have to go with this particular agency, or only one group should be allowed to punish criminals and things like that. And like when you take that concept away, that immediately, right, the image probably, which is an essentially a valid image of anarchy, where you have all of these different firms nitpicking on what they think is right and wrong. Which, yeah, that's true to a point, but that doesn't necessarily mean there's going to be utter chaos and massive war, and every little argument is going to turn into a nuclear situation, and which is what statists believe. Most people don't want those things to happen, and so that's going to be reflected in the marketplace. Just as it is now, in a sense, with voting, or at least try to manifest through this belief in voting. But yeah, anyway, I guess I'll end that rant. Just some thoughts from my anarchist perspective, I guess. Oh man, well, if anybody listens to this, let me know what you think, and especially socialists, if would you accept the abolition of the state right now? Even if you think the capitalists are going to make a new one, I don't care, whatever. If the state were to be abolished today, would you be okay with that? And if not, what are the criteria? And I need something more specific than abolish capitalism. I mean, I don't understand why you would think the state is necessary ever. Like, ever. Like, it's the shared fundamental belief that the state is our protector that you have with Republicans and Democrats and everyone else. It's all the same belief. You think the state is our protector, and it's just been corrupted, which is exactly what every single statist who disagrees with the current so-called party in power thinks. Because you think the state should be used to protect the workers and make things more equal. And it's just simply not what a state does or is. In no way has it ever been that. Not even in concept is it that, when you actually know what the words mean when they start talking about these things, sovereignty and legislation, taxation, things. When you understand what those words actually are in reality, what those symbols are meant to symbolize versus what other symbols mean, like robbery, you would realize that there's no way a state is necessary for anything. No matter how crazy society is, a state doesn't fix anything. A state's just a gang saying it's the only one that can try to fix things, and its solution is always violence. You're not allowed to put bounties on people. The state can. The state can kill you if they think it's justified in a lot of areas. They still think. I just don't see how that would be any different than a jury or, the common law or private arbitration. Other than, most of those firms probably would only think of the death penalty in serious crimes. And they would understand that who initiates force. Because the state wants to put you to death for a lot of things that might be justified, like defending against state enforcers. Like if a state enforcer is enforcing an immoral law, then the moral thing to do, well, it's kind of your choice. But if you stop him, it's not immoral. It's not immoral to stop a cop from enforcing an immoral law. It doesn't make any sense, because you've already, if you accept the premise that the particular law is immoral, it's just the logic of the situation. If one action is immoral, stopping it cannot be immoral. But there's the belief in the law, which they say, well, yeah, if the law is immoral, you have to vote to change it. You can't stop the cop. You're a terrorist. You're a criminal if you defend people from the police. And that's the crazy belief in government. That's that double standard that they have for morality. That it's not only is it's immoral for one person to do something, but not only is it moral for another to do it, or not only is it not immoral for another to do it, but it's moral for him to do it, and it's immoral for you to stop him, even though it would be okay and moral for someone to stop you from doing it. And the only real difference they have in their mind is the rationalization of voting, which is most of the people around here said it was okay. So, and that has no bearing on the morality of something. And if you think it does, then, I mean, how far away are you from saying slavery can be moral because the majority thinks so? Alrighty, that's the end of this piece.